In the heart of a raging blizzard, high on a desolate mountain peak, ex-commando Henry Lawson finally found the place where his loyal dog had risked everything to lead him, the wreckage of a small plane perched precariously on a cliff's edge. Through a cracked window, he saw what seemed to be a normal scene, a man tending to an injured young woman beside a small fire. But then, in a fleeting moment when the man's back was turned, the woman silently raised her hand, her trembling fingers forming a desperate, silent plea for help. Instantly, Henry understood the horrifying truth. This was no accident. It was a hostage situation, and he was the only person who knew. What would he do, all alone, facing an unknown villain and a storm that threatened to bury them all? Support us by subscribing to our channel to follow this breathtaking rescue journey. The scream was silent, a ghost of a sound trapped in the cavern of his own mind. Dust, thick and suffocating, filled his lungs. It tasted of sand and sorrow. The midday sun of Kandahar beat down, a merciless hammer on the cracked earth, but in his dream, Henry Lawson felt only a profound, bone-deep cold. He was running, his boots heavy, his rifle a useless weight in his hands. He was running towards a name, a brother, Owen. The world erupted in a flash of white-hot light, followed by a roar that deafened the universe. When vision returned, the world was painted in shades of chaos and red. And through it all, he saw Owen Clark's eyes, wide with a final, silent question. Henry's own eyes snapped open. The roar of the explosion faded, replaced by the howl of the Colorado wind whipping around the corners of his small log cabin. He was tangled in his sheets, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. A cold sweat slicked his skin despite the chill in the room. He sat up, swinging his legs over the side of the bed and burying his face in his hands. The dream was always the same, a relentless echo from a mission that had ended years ago but had never truly ended for him. Henry Lawson was a man living in the past, a ghost haunting the shell of his own life. In his late 30s, his tall, lean frame still held the disciplined strength of his years as an Army Ranger, but a certain weariness had settled into his bones. His brown hair, cut short in a way that had become habit, was flecked with silver at the temples. A dense beard and stubble covered a jawline that was perpetually tight, hiding a face that was rugged but etched with a kindness he rarely allowed himself to show. His eyes, a deep shade of blue, often seemed distant, fixed on a horizon no one else could see. He pushed himself to his feet and walked to the small kitchen, his movements economical and quiet. The cabin was his sanctuary, his prison. Nestled deep in the Rocky Mountains, miles from the nearest town, it offered him the one thing he craved above all else: silence. Here, the only sounds were the wind, the cry of a distant hawk, and the crackle of the fire in the hearth. Here, there were no sudden noises to send his mind spiraling back to the desert. He pulled on his clothes, the familiar uniform of his self-imposed exile, a faded navy and gray plaid shirt over a simple gray t-shirt, worn-out blue jeans, and a pair of sturdy work boots. Glancing out the window, he saw the snow had picked up. Fat, heavy flakes drifted down from a bruised-looking sky, blanketing the world in a pristine, unforgiving white. It was late afternoon, and the light was already beginning to fade, casting long blue shadows across the landscape. He spent the next hour in a routine that kept the demons at bay, chopping wood, checking his perimeter, making a pot of coffee that was more about the ritual than the caffeine. It was a life of repetition, a life stripped down to the bare essentials of survival. It was all he felt he deserved. As he was stacking the newly split logs on the porch, he saw it, a dark shape against the snow just beyond the tree line. It was too small to be a deer, too large for a coyote. Henry's training kicked in instantly. His body went still, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the area. The shape was unmoving. He watched it for a full minute, the cold seeping through his clothes, before his curiosity overrode his ingrained caution. He grabbed the heavy, high-powered flashlight he kept by the door and made his way through the deepening snow. As he got closer, the shape resolved itself. It was a dog, a large one, lying on its side, its form a stark contrast to the pure white snow which was stained a dark, ugly crimson around it. Henry's heart gave a painful lurch. He knelt, his movements slow and deliberate, not wanting to startle the animal if it was still alive. It was a German shepherd, a magnificent creature with a thick coat of gray and white fur. It couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 years old, but now it lay broken and still. Its breathing was shallow, each exhale a faint puff of condensation in the frigid air. One of its hind legs was twisted at an unnatural angle, and a deep, ragged gash ran along its flank, still oozing blood. Henry's hands, calloused and scarred from years of military service, moved with a gentle, practiced efficiency. He was no longer Henry Lawson, the haunted recluse. He was Sergeant Lawson, the field medic, the man trained to save lives in the worst possible conditions. His own pain, his own ghosts, were shoved aside by the urgent, immediate need of the creature before him. "Easy there, boy," he murmured, his voice rough from disuse. "Just let me take a look." The dog's eyes fluttered open. They were a deep, intelligent amber, and for a moment they were filled with pain and fear. But as it looked at Henry, something seemed to shift. The fear receded, replaced by a flicker of something else. Trust, perhaps, or maybe just the last desperate hope of a dying animal. It let out a low whine but made no move to resist as Henry gently probed the wound. "All right, we need to get you inside," Henry said, more to himself than to the dog. Carefully, he slid his arms underneath the shepherd's heavy body. The dog was solid muscle, weighing nearly 100 pounds, but Henry lifted it with a grunt, his own strength surprising him. He carried the animal back to the cabin, each step a struggle through the thick snow. Inside, he laid the dog down on an old blanket in front of the hearth. The warmth of the fire seemed to revive it slightly. Henry retrieved his old medic bag from a dusty footlocker in his bedroom. The contents were years old but well preserved: sterile dressings, antiseptic wipes, sutures, and painkillers. For the next hour, he worked with intense concentration. He cleaned the wound, his touch firm but gentle. He stitched the gash with steady hands, the small, precise movements a familiar balm to his troubled mind. He set the broken leg as best he could, fashioning a splint from 2 pieces of kindling and strips of torn cloth. He crushed a couple of painkillers and mixed them with a little water, carefully syringing the mixture into the side of the dog's mouth. Through it all, the dog, who he had decided to call Bear, remained passive, accepting his help. It seemed to understand that this human was trying to save it. When Henry was finished, he sat back on his heels, a wave of exhaustion washing over him. The firelight danced across Bear's fur, and the cabin was quiet except for the crackle of the flames and the dog's now steady, even breathing. Henry looked at the animal lying by his fire, a creature that had appeared from nowhere, a broken piece of the world that had washed up on his isolated shore. For the first time in a very long time, he felt a flicker of something other than grief or guilt. In the act of saving this one life, he had, for a few precious hours, saved a small part of himself. The ghosts were still there, waiting in the shadows, but for tonight they were quiet. For tonight he was not alone. The first light of dawn crept over the snow-laden peaks, filtering through the cabin's single window as a soft, gray luminescence. For the first time in years, Henry Lawson had slept through the night without the familiar specter of Kandahar haunting his dreams. He woke not to the silent scream of an explosion, but to a low, rhythmic breathing from the floor beside his bed. He had moved Bear there during the night, placing the blanket closer for warmth and observation. He sat up, his joints stiff from the cold, and looked down. The German shepherd's amber eyes were open, watching him with an unnerving stillness. There was no tail wagging, no eager panting, just a calm, steady gaze that seemed to hold 1,000 unspoken questions. "Morning, soldier," Henry said softly, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. He had not shared his space with another living being for a very long time. He carefully swung his legs out of bed, his movements slow. The dog's head tilted, its ears swiveling to track his every move, but it made no sound. Henry went about his morning routine, lighting the wood stove and putting coffee on to brew. Every so often, he would glance over at Bear. The animal remained watchful, its posture relaxed but alert. It was the posture of a creature trained for patience, for surveillance. It was the posture of a sentry on duty. After a quick breakfast of coffee and dry toast, Henry turned his full attention to his patient. He filled a bowl with fresh water and placed it on the floor. Bear lifted his head, sniffed the water, and then looked back at Henry as if waiting for permission. "It's for you," Henry said. "Go on." Only then did the dog lower its head and begin to drink, lapping up the water methodically. When it was done, it looked back at Henry and gave a soft thump of its tail against the wooden floor. A single, deliberate sign of thanks. A shiver of respect ran down Henry's spine. This was no ordinary dog. Later, as he prepared to clean and redress the wounds, he saw more signs. As he reached for a clean cloth on a nearby shelf, his movement was a little too quick. A normal dog, especially one in pain, might have yelped or flinched away. Bear did neither. Instead, its entire body tensed for a microsecond, muscles coiling into a state of absolute readiness. Its eyes, sharp and focused, did not look at Henry with fear, but scanned the space around him, assessing for a threat. The reaction was over as quickly as it began, but Henry saw it clearly. It was the ingrained, reflexive response of a highly trained operator. "Where did you come from, boy?" he wondered aloud as he gently began to work on the splint, checking to make sure it was secure but not too tight. He saved the deep gash on its flank for last. In the dim firelight of the previous night, he had been focused solely on stopping the bleeding and closing the wound. Now, in the clear morning light, he could examine it more closely. As he carefully cleaned the area around the stitches, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The edges of the wound, where he had sutured them together, were unnaturally clean. An animal attack? A fall against sharp rocks? These things left ragged, torn flesh. This was different. This was a slice, a deliberate cut. His fingers, sensitive from years of handling weaponry and equipment, traced the fur just above the wound. He felt it then, a faint telltale singe. The fur was burnt. He pushed the hair aside and saw the undeniable evidence, a long, thin graze mark along the skin, puckered and scarred by extreme heat. It was a bullet graze. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a fight with a wolf or a mountain lion. Someone had done this. Someone had shot this dog and left it for dead. The clean slice was likely from the bullet tearing through the skin, and the broken leg from the impact as it fell. This was an act of calculated violence. Henry sat back, the bloody cloth forgotten in his hand. He looked at Bear, who was watching him with that same steady, intelligent gaze. Suddenly, the quiet strength, the trained reflexes, the patient endurance, it all made a terrible kind of sense. Bear was not just a survivor, it was a soldier, a comrade left behind on the battlefield. A wave of cold fury, an emotion Henry had not allowed himself to feel for years, washed over him. He had spent his exile trying to numb himself to the violence of the world, to the cruelty of men. But this was different. This was a betrayal of the highest order. To harm an animal so loyal, so magnificent, was an act of profound cowardice. The bond that had started to form between them solidified in that moment, forged in the shared experience of violence and survival. He was no longer just a man caring for a stray. He was a veteran looking at a fellow soldier, a brother in arms who had been wronged. The scars they carried, both visible and invisible, were now a bridge between them. He spent the rest of the day in a state of quiet focus. He cooked a small portion of unseasoned ground beef and fed it to Bear, who ate it with a quiet dignity. He sat by the fire, cleaning his rifle not out of routine, but with a renewed sense of purpose. Bear lay nearby, sleeping now, its body finally succumbing to the exhaustion of its ordeal. As evening fell and the shadows grew long, Henry stood by the window, looking out at the vast, silent expanse of the Rocky Mountains. The snow had stopped, and the world was a canvas of white and deep blue. He looked from the mountains back to the sleeping dog. His life in this cabin had been an act of retreat, a surrender. He had come here to let the world forget him, and to try and forget it in return. But the world had found him. It had sent him a messenger, a wounded soldier with a story etched into its very flesh. He knew with a certainty that settled deep in his gut that Bear's journey had not ended here by chance. It had been a desperate pilgrimage to the only place it could go. This was not the end of a mission. It was the beginning. And for the first time since he had lost Owen, Henry Lawson felt like he had a mission again. The days that followed settled into a quiet, unspoken rhythm. Time in the cabin was measured not by a clock, but by the slow, steady progress of healing. Henry changed Bear's dressings twice a day, noting with satisfaction that the wound on his flank was closing cleanly, the skin knitting itself back together. The splint on the dog's leg remained, a stark reminder of the violence it had endured. But Bear was beginning to put a little weight on it, his movements less pained and more deliberate. A silent understanding grew between them. It was the easy camaraderie of soldiers who have learned to communicate without words. A nod from Henry was enough to tell Bear it was time to eat. A soft nudge from Bear's head against his hand was a request to go outside. They were two solitary beings, orbiting each other in the quiet space of the cabin, their shared silence a comfortable blanket against the howling world outside. For Henry, the simple, focused tasks of caring for another creature were a form of therapy he had never known he needed. Measuring out food, changing bandages, stoking the fire to keep the cabin warm, these small acts of responsibility anchored him to the present. They were a bulwark against the relentless tide of the past. The nightmares still came, but they were less frequent, their edges softened by the presence of the warm, breathing animal at the foot of his bed. By the fifth day, Bear was strong enough to limp around the cabin for short periods. It was then that the new behavior began. It started subtly. Henry would look up from his book or from cleaning his gear and find Bear sitting by the large picture window that faced the rugged western peaks. The dog would be perfectly still, a stoic silhouette against the vast, snowy landscape, its gaze fixed on one particular point in the distance, a jagged, tooth-like summit that clawed at the sky. At first, Henry thought little of it. It was probably watching for wildlife, its instincts alert to the movements of deer or elk in the valley. But the watching became more intense. It was no longer a passive observation. It was a vigil. Bear would stand there for an hour at a time, unmoving, its entire being focused on that distant mountain. Then came the sounds. It started as a low whine, a soft, mournful note that seemed to be pulled from the depths of its soul. The sound was filled with a profound and desperate urgency. Henry would try to distract him. He'd call his name, offer him a piece of jerky, or try to coax him back to the warmth of the fire. Bear would turn, give him a look that was almost an apology, and then immediately turn back to the window, the low, pleading sound resuming. The behavior escalated. The whining grew into a restless agitation. Bear began to pace, a three-legged limping circuit from the window to Henry and back again. He would nudge Henry's hand with his wet nose, his amber eyes wide and imploring. Then he would limp back to the window, look out at the mountain, and let out a soft, frustrated bark. It was the clearest communication Henry had ever witnessed from an animal. It was a message, an insistent, desperate plea. Look, you have to look. What is it, boy? Henry would ask, kneeling beside him and looking out at the same vista. What do you see out there? He saw nothing but snow and rock and sky. He scanned the mountains with his binoculars, his trained eyes searching for any sign of movement, any wisp of smoke, anything out of the ordinary. There was nothing, just the vast, beautiful, and empty wilderness. He tried to reason it away. The dog was traumatized. Perhaps something on that mountain reminded it of where the attack had happened. Perhaps it was a form of post-traumatic stress, something Henry understood all too well. But the explanation didn't sit right. Bear's actions weren't born of fear or panic. They were driven by an unshakable purpose. There was a raw, undeniable intelligence in his eyes, a frustration at his inability to make the human understand. One evening, as a deep purple twilight settled over the peaks, the sound changed again. Bear stood at the window, his body rigid, and let out a single, mournful howl. It was not the call of a wild wolf, but something different. It was a sound of profound loyalty and loss, a desperate attempt to reach someone or something across the vast frozen distance. The sound echoed off the mountains, a lonely cry in the immense silence, and it sent a chill down Henry's spine that had nothing to do with the cold. That was the moment everything shifted. Henry looked at Bear, truly looked at him, and saw past the injured animal. He saw the soldier. He remembered the calm acceptance of his medical care, the disciplined responses, the quiet dignity. This was not a dog lost in a haze of trauma. This was an operator trying to complete a mission. His own instincts, buried for years under layers of grief and isolation, roared back to life. He felt the old, familiar surge of adrenaline, the sharp focus that comes when a mission is defined. He had been waiting. He realized it now. He had been waiting for a purpose, for a reason to fight again. And it was here, standing beside him on 3 good legs, its heart full of a loyalty he could only begin to comprehend. He walked to the window and stood beside Bear, placing a hand on the thick fur of his neck. He looked out at the jagged peak, no longer seeing an empty landscape, but a destination, a target. "Okay," Henry said, his voice quiet but firm in the still cabin. "I hear you." Bear stopped whining. He looked up at Henry, his tail giving a single, powerful thump against the floor. His eyes were clear, focused, and filled with a desperate gratitude. The message had been received. Henry gave the dog's neck a firm squeeze. "All right, soldier," he said. "You lead the way." He turned from the window and walked decisively towards the footlocker where he kept his serious gear. The time for hiding was over. The mission had begun. The old footlocker at the end of Henry's bed opened with a familiar, dusty sigh. It was a time capsule, a repository of a life he had tried to leave behind. But as he looked at its contents, he felt no trace of his usual resentment. Instead, a grim, quiet purpose settled over him. This was not a retreat into the past, it was a reawakening. His hands, steady and sure, moved through the neatly organized gear, selecting each item with the methodical precision of a soldier preparing for a long-range reconnaissance mission. He laid everything out on his bed. A heavy-duty backpack, weatherproofed and durable, thermal layers of clothing, a waterproof outer shell in a muted gray that would blend with the rock and snow, high-energy protein bars, and a lightweight portable stove. A military-grade first aid kit, far more comprehensive than the one he had used on Bear. A climbing rope, carabiners, and an ice axe. His high-powered binoculars and a GPS unit with fresh batteries. Lastly, he checked his Remington 700, a bolt-action rifle he could fire accurately at 1,000 yards, and holstered the Sig Sauer P226 that had been his trusted sidearm for years. He was no longer a man hiding from the world, he was a force moving within it. While he worked, Bear watched from his spot by the fire, his amber eyes tracking every movement. The anxious whining was gone, replaced by the quiet patience of a soldier waiting for his commanding officer. When Henry was finally geared up, looking more like the ranger he once was than the recluse he had become, he turned to the dog. "All right, boy, I'm ready," he said. He had fashioned a protective wrap for Bear's splinted leg, using a piece of waterproof canvas to keep it dry. "This is your mission. I'm just providing support." Bear rose, his limp pronounced, but his determination unwavering. He led the way to the door, pausing to look back at Henry, a clear and urgent command in his eyes. Henry took a deep breath, the frigid air stinging his lungs, and stepped out into the biting wind, closing the door of his sanctuary behind him. The world was a maelstrom of white. The blizzard that had been threatening for days had descended with full force, reducing visibility to a mere 50 feet. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, tearing at his clothes and driving shards of ice into his exposed skin. It was a landscape designed to kill, a place of profound and deadly indifference. But to Henry, it was just another hostile environment, an obstacle to be overcome. Bear took the lead without hesitation. He moved with a surprising speed, his 3 good legs finding purchase where Henry saw only a treacherous blanket of white. He was not just wandering towards the mountain, he was following a path only he could see, his nose to the ground, his body a low gray and white arrow against the storm. They moved in silence, a 2-man team in perfect sync. Henry fell into the old rhythms of patrol, his senses on high alert. He watched their back trail, scanned the trees for any sign of movement, and listened to the sounds of the storm, his mind sifting through the noise for anything out of place. He trusted Bear's direction, but he did not trust the wilderness. Hours passed. The sun was a pale, forgotten memory behind the thick ceiling of clouds. They climbed steadily, the terrain growing steeper and more treacherous. They navigated through dense pine forests, their branches heavy with snow, and across frozen streams, the ice groaning under their weight. They were traversing a narrow ridge, a spine of rock with a steep drop on either side, when it happened. Henry placed his boot onto what he thought was solid ground, but it was a patch of black ice hidden beneath a thin dusting of snow. His foot shot out from under him. For a horrifying second, he was airborne, his arms flailing for a handhold that wasn't there. His heavy pack pulled him backwards, dragging him towards the edge of the abyss. Panic, cold and sharp, seized him. The world slowed down. He could see the jagged rocks hundreds of feet below, a promise of a swift and brutal end. The howl of the wind filled his ears. This is it, he thought. This is how it ends. Then a sudden violent jolt. His fall was arrested, with a force that knocked the wind out of him. He looked up, bewildered. Bear had lunged, his powerful jaws clamped down on the thick fabric of his jacket's shoulder. The dog's claws scrabbled for purchase on the ice, his muscles straining, a low growl of pure effort rumbling in his chest. He was a living anchor, the only thing tethering Henry to the world of the living. For a long moment, they were frozen in a desperate tableau, man and dog against the merciless pull of gravity. Bear's hind legs began to slip, his injured leg trembling with the strain. He was losing his grip. Henry's training kicked in, shoving the panic aside. "Hold on," he yelled, his voice snatched away by the wind. He swung his free hand, the one not clawing at the ice, and fumbled for his ice axe. His fingers, numb with cold, closed around the handle. With a surge of adrenaline, he slammed the pick into the ice just inches from the ledge. It held. He tested it, then slammed it in again, deeper this time. Using it as a purchase point, he pulled himself up, inch by agonizing inch, the weight of his pack a leaden shroud. Bear never let go, his grip a vice, his body a trembling bastion of loyalty. Finally, Henry scrambled over the ledge, collapsing onto the flat surface of the ridge, chest heaving, his body trembling with the aftershock of adrenaline. He lay there for a moment, the snow cold against his cheek, his heart hammering against his ribs. Bear immediately released his jacket and began licking his face, his body still shaking with the effort, his whines a mixture of concern and relief. Henry pushed himself into a sitting position and wrapped his arms around the dog's thick neck, burying his face in its fur. "You saved me," he whispered, the words raw with an emotion he hadn't felt in a decade. "You saved my life, Bear." He pulled back and looked into the dog's amber eyes. The last vestiges of his doubt, the final cynical walls he had built around his heart, crumbled into dust. This was not just an animal. This was not just a guide. This was a partner, a brother. In that moment, on that windswept ridge, their bond was sealed in the crucible of near death, becoming something absolute and unbreakable. He owed this dog his life. He gave Bear a final rough pat. "Okay," he said, his voice steady now. "Let's finish this, together." He got to his feet, checked his gear, and looked towards the jagged peak, now closer than ever. The storm raged on, but something inside him had changed. He was no longer just a man following a dog. They were a single unit, moving as one, two soldiers pushing deeper into enemy territory, bound by a shared purpose and an unshakable trust. The bond forged on the icy ridge transformed their journey. They were no longer man and guide, but a single, synchronized unit, moving with a shared and unspoken understanding. The trust between them was absolute. Henry no longer questioned Bear's path, and Bear no longer needed to plead for Henry to follow. They pushed onward, deeper into the blizzard's heart, their progress slow but relentless against the fury of the elements. As they drew closer to the jagged peak that had been their beacon, the terrain became a chaotic jumble of rock and ice. The wind was a physical force, a battering ram that threatened to tear them from the mountainside. For 2 more hours, they fought for every foot of ground. Henry's muscles burned, and his lungs ached with every frozen breath, but he pushed the pain aside, his focus narrowed to the mission. Beside him, Bear was a portrait of unwavering resolve, his injured leg a constant nagging pain that he seemed to ignore through sheer force of will. It was Bear who signaled their arrival. He stopped abruptly at the edge of a steep, snowy basin, his body going rigid. A low growl, different from any sound Henry had heard him make before, rumbled deep in his chest. It was not a sound of aggression, but of intense, focused warning. Henry crouched beside him, his own senses on high alert. He raised his binoculars, his hands shielding the lenses from the swirling snow, and followed Bear's intense gaze. At first he saw nothing but a wall of white. Then, as the wind momentarily parted the curtain of the blizzard, the scene snapped into sharp, horrifying focus. There it was, not at the bottom of a cliff, as one might expect from a catastrophic fall, but wedged improbably onto a wide, snow-covered ledge about halfway down the basin. It was a small, twin-engine plane, a Beechcraft King Air by the looks of it. One wing was crumpled against a sheer rock face, and its tail was twisted at an unnatural angle. A long, deep scar, hundreds of yards long, was carved into the mountainside above it, a violent trail of disturbed snow and shattered trees. It hadn't fallen from the sky. It had skidded, a terrifying, uncontrolled slide down the mountain before coming to a rest on this precarious perch. The detail was crucial. It made the idea of survival a slim but terrifying possibility. "Steady, boy," Henry whispered, placing a calming hand on Bear's back. The dog's muscles were coiled as tight as a spring. Henry scanned the wreckage with the methodical precision of a battlefield assessment. The cockpit was a mangled ruin of metal and glass, and a large section of the fuselage had been torn open, exposing the interior to the elements. There were no obvious signs of fire, but the damage was catastrophic. It was a tomb of twisted metal, a monument to a final, violent moment. He was about to lower the binoculars, a grim sense of finality settling in his gut when he saw it. A detail that didn't fit. Near the open gash in the plane's side, the pristine blanket of snow was disturbed. They were faint, already being filled in by the driving blizzard, but they were unmistakable. Footprints. Someone had been outside the plane, and recently. His heart began to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He swept the binoculars across the area again, his search now frantic. Who had made them? A survivor? A rescuer? His gaze traveled from the footprints up to the torn fuselage. And then he saw the second sign, so faint it was almost invisible. From a small, jagged hole in the roof of the plane, a thin, almost translucent wisp of smoke was rising. It was barely there, a pale gray ghost against the swirling white of the storm. But it was real. The smoke was whipped away by the wind almost as soon as it appeared, but it was enough. Smoke meant fire, fire meant warmth, and warmth meant life. Someone was alive in that wreckage. A wave of relief washed over him, quickly followed by a cold tide of caution. His training took over, overriding the immediate human impulse to rush down and offer help. A survivor was one thing, but the nature of that survival was another. Why hadn't they activated an emergency beacon? Why hadn't they tried to signal for help in a more obvious way. The small, barely visible wisp of smoke felt less like a signal and more like an attempt to stay hidden. He thought back to Bear. The bullet graze, the deliberate violence. This was not a simple, tragic accident. The pieces were starting to form a dark and unsettling picture. A plane crash, a trained dog, shot and left for dead. At least one survivor holed up in the wreckage, trying not to be found. Henry's mission parameters changed in an instant. This was no longer a rescue operation, it was a potential hostage situation, or something worse. He was moving into a tactical problem, and the person or people in that plane could be victims, or they could be the ones who had pulled the trigger on Bear. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. He pulled back from the edge of the basin, dragging a reluctant Bear with him. They found cover behind a large outcropping of rock, shielded from the wind and, more importantly, from view of the crash site. He needed a plan. Rushing in was suicide. He had to approach with stealth, to observe, to gather intelligence before making his presence known. He looked down at his partner. Bear's growl had subsided, but he was still on high alert, his eyes fixed on the wreckage below, his body radiating a tense, protective energy. "I know you want to go down there," Henry said softly, rubbing the dog's head. "I know they're in there, but we don't know who they are." Bear looked up at him, a flicker of understanding in his intelligent eyes. He whined softly, a sound of profound conflict. His instinct was to go, to protect, but his trust in Henry held him in place. "We do this my way," Henry said, his voice a low, determined command. "We go in quiet, we get the lay of the land, and we make sure we're not walking into a trap." He took out his rifle, the cold steel a familiar and steadying weight in his hands, and chambered around. The quiet click was the only sound that pierced the howl of the wind. He was no longer just a man on a mountain. He was a soldier on approach to a target of unknown hostility, and he would not fail. The plan formed in Henry's mind with cold, swift clarity. A direct assault was out of the question. The blizzard, while providing cover, also made the terrain unpredictable. More importantly, he had no idea about the situation inside the plane. How many people? Were they armed? Who was the victim, and who was the threat? He needed eyes on the target before he could act. He turned to Bear, who was still vibrating with a tense, controlled energy. Henry knelt, looking the dog directly in the eyes. "Listen to me," he said, his voice a low, firm command. "I'm going down there. You stay here. You hold this position, and you wait for my signal. Do you understand? You wait." He used the same tone he had used with his old K9 unit, a tone that conveyed absolute, non-negotiable authority. Bear whined softly, a sound of protest and deep-seated worry. His instinct was to go with his partner, to protect him. But the training, the years of discipline ingrained in his very being, won out. He sat, his body still rigid with alertness, and gave Henry a short, affirmative bark. He understood. He would hold. Henry gave him a final, firm pat. "Good boy," he whispered. He trusted the dog implicitly. Bear would not move from this spot unless Henry gave the word, or unless all hell broke loose below. With his partner providing overwatch, Henry began his descent. He moved with the practiced stealth of a ghost, using the rock formations and the swirling snow as his allies. He did not take the direct route down the scar the plane had carved. That would be too obvious. Instead, he took a longer, more circuitous path, approaching the wreckage from its blind side, the side crumpled against the sheer rock wall. Every step was a calculated risk. The snow was deep and unstable, and the wind threatened to rip him from his footing. But he moved with a patient, fluid grace, his body low to the ground, his rifle held at a low, ready position. The journey down took him nearly 30 minutes, a slow, painstaking crawl that tested his endurance and his nerve. Finally, he was there. He pressed himself flat against the cold metal skin of the fuselage, his back to the rock face. He was directly beneath the twisted tail section. The howling of the wind was louder here, a deafening roar, as it funneled through the wreckage. He was completely hidden from view. He took a moment to control his breathing, letting the adrenaline sharpen his senses, not cloud them. He began to inch his way along the side of the plane, moving towards the large, torn opening in the fuselage. He kept his profile impossibly low, a shadow moving against a larger shadow. As he neared the opening, he could feel a faint warmth radiating from within, and he could smell the acrid scent of burning plastic mixed with pine. He stopped just short of the gash, his heart pounding. The opening was too large, too exposed. To look through it would be to reveal himself. He needed another way. He continued his slow crawl, his gloved hands searching the cold metal for any other point of entry, any vulnerability. He found it a few feet further down, a passenger window, miraculously intact, but spiderwebbed with a network of fine cracks. It was frosted over, but a small section near the bottom was clear, offering a distorted, narrow view of the cabin within. It was perfect. He carefully cleared the snow from around the window, then positioned himself so only his eyes were visible. He took a deep, silent breath and looked inside. The scene was one of desperate survival. A small, smoky fire burned in a makeshift pit fashioned from a metal floor panel. The flames licked at pieces of torn seat cushions and splintered bits of wood from the plane's interior trim. The fire provided a flickering, hellish light that danced across the two figures huddled near it. The first was a young woman, likely in her early 20s. Her name, he would later learn, was Hannah Cole. She was pale and drawn, her face smudged with soot, her eyes wide with a fear that seemed to have settled deep into her bones. Her dark hair was matted, and her clothes were torn. One of her legs was propped up on a piece of luggage, wrapped in a crude splint made from a curtain rod and strips of fabric. The pant leg around it was dark with dried blood. Sitting across from her was a man. He was broad-shouldered and had the lean, capable look of someone who knew how to handle himself in tough situations. He was methodically feeding small pieces of a shattered suitcase into the fire, his movements calm and efficient. This had to be Henshaw. He was tending to the fire, seemingly tending to the young woman, playing the part of a fellow survivor. But there was a coldness in his eyes, a watchful intensity that did not match his seemingly helpful actions. He wasn't caring for her. He was guarding her. Henry watched them for a full 10 minutes, his body motionless in the freezing cold. They did not speak. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the scream of the wind outside. Henshaw kept the fire going while Hannah simply stared into the flames, her expression a mask of numb despair. Henry was about to pull back, to reassess, when something happened. Henshaw's attention was drawn to a section of the fire that was sputtering. He turned his back fully on Hannah to poke at it with a metal shard, trying to get it to catch. It was a small window of opportunity, no more than a few seconds. But it was enough. Hannah's eyes, which had been fixed on the fire, darted towards the cracked window. Henry froze, convinced she had seen him. But her gaze was unfocused, a desperate, sweeping glance at the outside world, at the storm that was her prison. And then her hand, which had been lying limply in her lap, moved. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible gesture. She kept her palm facing down, hidden from Henshaw's line of sight. Slowly, deliberately, she tucked her thumb under her fingers and then extended them out again. She did it twice. It was not a wave. It was not a random movement. It was a signal. A silent, desperate scream for help, a gesture that spoke a universal language of capture and fear. Ice flowed through Henry's veins. All the pieces of the puzzle slammed into place with brutal certainty. The bullet graze on Bear, the hidden fire, the guard-like demeanor of the man. And now, this. It was a hostage situation. He now understood Bear's frantic urgency. The dog hadn't just been leading him to a crash, he had been leading him to her. Henry pulled back from the window, his movements slow and silent. He retreated the way he came, his mind a whirlwind of tactical calculations. The situation was infinitely more dangerous than he had imagined. He couldn't just announce himself. Henshaw was clearly resourceful and ruthless. He had survived the crash and had the presence of mind to take a prisoner. He would not hesitate to use Hannah as a shield or to eliminate her if he felt threatened. Henry reached his overwatch position, the outcropping of rock where Bear was waiting, his body a perfect, still statue of loyalty. The dog looked at him, a question in his eyes. Henry knelt and placed a hand on his head. His own expression was grim, his jaw set like granite. "You were right, boy," he whispered, his voice thick with a new and terrible resolve. "She's in there, and we're going to get her out." The resolve that had settled over Henry in the high, lonely perch was as cold and hard as the mountain itself. The mission was clear: extract the hostage. But the how was a complex and deadly puzzle. Henshaw was an unknown variable, but Henry had to assume he was dangerous, armed, and desperate. A frontal assault would get Hannah killed. He needed a strategy, a way to separate the captor from the captive. He remained behind the rock, the blizzard his shield, and watched the wreckage below. For nearly an hour, nothing changed. The faint wisp of smoke continued its dance with the wind. He knew he couldn't wait forever. Their small fire would eventually run out of fuel. Hannah's injury needed proper medical attention, and the storm, while providing cover, was also a relentless enemy, sapping their strength. Patience. In the field, patience was a weapon. He forced himself to remain still, observing, waiting for Henshaw to make a mistake. The mistake came, as it often does, born of necessity. A plume of thicker, darker smoke suddenly billowed from the hole in the fuselage, followed by a noticeable decrease in the fire's warm glow against the cracked window. They were running low on fuel. A few minutes later, the torn opening of the fuselage darkened as Henshaw's silhouette appeared. He stood there for a moment, scanning the storm-swept landscape. Henry pressed himself lower, becoming one with the rock and snow. Henshaw, apparently satisfied that they were alone, stepped out of the wreckage. He carried a small hatchet, likely from the plane's emergency kit. He began moving towards a small grove of stunted, snow-laden pines 100 yards from the crash site, his objective clear: chop more wood for the fire. This was the chance. It would be a short window, maybe 15, 20 minutes at most. Henry turned to Bear. "Stay," he commanded in a whisper. The dog didn't even flinch. His eyes locked on Henshaw's retreating figure, a low growl barely audible beneath the wind. Henry moved the moment Henshaw was obscured by the swirling snow. He didn't descend the way he had before. It was too slow. He took the most direct route, a controlled, half-sliding, half-running descent down the snowy scar the plane had made. He moved with a breathtaking speed and silence, his years of training guiding his every step. He reached the fuselage and, without hesitating, slipped through the jagged opening into the relative quiet of the cabin. The change in environment was jarring. The roar of the wind was instantly muffled, replaced by the hiss and crackle of the dying fire. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of fear. Hannah was right where he had seen her, huddled by the smoldering embers. Her head snapped up at his sudden appearance, her eyes widening in terror. A scream caught in her throat, but Henry was already moving, crossing the small space in 2 strides. He knelt in front of her, raising a gloved hand in a universal sign for quiet. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, his voice a low, urgent whisper. "I'm here to help. The dog, the gray and white shepherd, he led me here." The mention of the dog seemed to break through her fear. The terror in her eyes was replaced by a flicker of disbelief, and then a tidal wave of desperate hope. "Bear?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "He's alive?" "He's alive," Henry confirmed. "He's waiting up top. Now, we don't have much time. I need you to tell me everything, and you need to do it fast. Who is that man?" Tears began to stream down her soot-stained cheeks, but she choked them back, her focus absolute. "His name is Henshaw," she said, her words tumbling out in a rushed, hushed torrent. "He was the co-pilot. This wasn't an accident. He did this." Henry's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" "He sabotaged the plane," she explained, her voice trembling with a mixture of grief and rage. "He waited until we were over the most remote part of the mountains. He killed my father." She gestured towards the mangled cockpit. My father was the pilot. Henshaw wanted something he was carrying. What was it? Henry pressed, his eyes darting towards the opening, watching for any sign of Henshaw's return. Documents, she said. Proof. My father was an environmental investigator. He had uncovered a massive illegal rare earth mining operation. The documents proved who was behind it, a powerful corporation. He was flying them to a journalist in Denver. Henshaw was working for them. He was supposed to retrieve the documents and get rid of the evidence and the witnesses. The pieces locked into place. The crash, the remoteness, the calculated violence. And Bear? Henry asked, the final question. Her face crumpled. Bear was my father's dog. He flew with us all the time. After the crash, after everything stopped moving, Bear managed to get out through that opening. Henshaw saw him. He raised his pistol to shoot him, to get rid of the last witness. I screamed, and it must have startled him. He fired, but in the storm, the shot only grazed Bear. The dog ran, disappearing into the blizzard. Henshaw thought he was gone for good, that the mountain would finish him. Henry's hand clenched into a fist. He now understood the dog's incredible journey, the sheer impossible will to survive. It hadn't just been instinct. It had been a mission, fueled by loyalty to the man he had lost and the woman he had to save. Where are the documents now? Henry asked. Henshaw has them, she said, nodding towards a durable-looking briefcase near Henshaw's makeshift bed. He's just been waiting for the storm to pass so he can hike out and disappear. Henry looked at her leg. And your injury? It happened in the crash, she said. It's why I couldn't run. It's why he's kept me alive. He needs me to verify to any potential rescuers that it was all a tragic accident. Once he's clear of the mountains, he'll have no more use for me. The unspoken words hung in the air between them, heavy and cold. Henry made a decision. I'm getting you out of here, he said. Right now. But as he moved to help her, a shadow fell across the opening. Henshaw stood there, hatchet in hand, his face a mask of cold surprise that quickly hardened into murderous fury. He had come back sooner than expected. The trap was sprung. The world seemed to shrink to the cramped, smoke-filled confines of the fuselage. For a heartbeat, the three figures were frozen in a tableau of shock and impending violence. The howling wind outside was a distant, irrelevant sound. Inside, the only noise was the sputtering of the dying fire and the harsh rasp of breath in the frigid air. Henshaw's surprise morphed into a mask of pure, predatory rage. His eyes, cold and calculating before, now burned with the fire of a cornered animal. He had been so close to waiting out the storm, hiking to freedom, and collecting his reward. This man, this ghost who had appeared from the heart of the blizzard, had ruined everything. Henry reacted on pure instinct. His body, honed by years of combat, moved before his conscious mind could fully process the threat. He shoved Hannah as gently as he could behind him, putting himself between her and Henshaw, using his larger frame as a shield. It's over, Henshaw, Henry said, his voice a low, steady growl. He kept his hands open, a gesture of de-escalation that was completely at odds with the coiled tension in his muscles. There's nowhere to go? Henshaw let out a harsh, barking laugh that held no humor. Over, he snarled, taking a step into the cabin. He hefted the hatchet, its polished edge catching the dim firelight. It's just getting started. I don't know who you are or how you found us, but you're not leaving this mountain alive. He lunged. There was no room for maneuver, no space for strategy. The fight was a brutal, claustrophobic explosion of violence. Henry, despite his training, was at an immediate disadvantage. His rifle was slung over his back, useless at this range. The cabin was a chaotic obstacle course of debris, luggage, and torn seats, limiting his footing. Henshaw, on the other hand, was fighting in a space he had inhabited for days. He moved with a desperate, savage familiarity, swinging the hatchet in a deadly arc. Henry dodged to the side, the blade of the hatchet whispering past his head, embedding itself with a sickening thud in the padded wall of the fuselage. Henry used the moment of Henshaw's overextension. He drove his shoulder hard into the other man's chest, sending him stumbling backward over a piece of wreckage. The hatchet was wrenched from the wall as Henshaw fell. Henry lunged for it, but Henshaw was faster, rolling and coming up in a crouch, the weapon held tight in his grip. The fight devolved into a desperate grapple. Henry grabbed Henshaw's wrist, his fingers locking like a vice, trying to keep the hatchet from coming into play. They crashed against the side of the plane, the metal groaning under their combined weight. Henshaw was strong, his muscles fueled by adrenaline and the raw will to survive. He brought his knee up hard into Henry's midsection, forcing a grunt of pain from the ex-soldier. Henry's vision swam for a second, but he held on, his knuckles white. He slammed Henshaw's weapon hand against a metal strut again and again, trying to force him to drop the hatchet. From behind him, he could hear Hannah's terrified gasps. "The briefcase!" Henshaw grunted, his face inches from Henry's, his breath hot and foul. "Give it to me, and I might let the girl live." "You were never going to let her live," Henry shot back, twisting and using his leverage to force Henshaw onto his back. They rolled on the floor of the cabin, a tangle of limbs and fury. The makeshift fire pit was kicked apart, sending glowing embers scattering across the floor. Small wisps of smoke began to rise from where they landed on the torn upholstery. The cabin was starting to fill with a thick, choking haze. Henry managed to land a solid punch on Henshaw's jaw, snapping his head to the side. For a second, Henshaw's grip on the hatchet loosened. Henry seized the opportunity, prying the weapon from his fingers and flinging it into the dark recesses of the cockpit. Disarmed but no less dangerous, Henshaw roared in frustration and drove his thumbs towards Henry's eyes. Henry twisted his head away just in time, the attack glancing off his temple. He pushed himself away, trying to create distance, to get back to his feet. But Henshaw was relentless. He scrambled after him, tackling him around the waist and driving him back against the opposite wall. The impact knocked the wind out of Henry, his head striking the cold metal with a jarring thud. Stars exploded behind his eyes. Henshaw's hands were suddenly around his throat, squeezing, cutting off his air. Henry's lungs screamed for oxygen. He clawed at Henshaw's hands, but the co-pilot's grip was like iron. Black spots danced in his vision. He was losing. Through the haze of his fading consciousness, he could see Hannah, desperately trying to move, to help, her face a mask of horror. He had failed. He had failed her, just as he had failed Owen. And then, through the roar of blood in his ears, he heard a new sound. It was not the wind. It was not the fire. It was a sound of pure, unrestrained fury. A deafening snarl ripped through the air, and a gray and white blur shot through the main opening of the fuselage. Bear. He had heard the sounds of the struggle, the sounds of his partner in peril, and the command to stay had been broken by a more powerful, primal instinct. Henshaw's head snapped up in disbelief. The dog he had shot, the animal he had left for dead in the blizzard, was here. It was a phantom, an avenging angel of loyalty and rage. He didn't even have time to scream. Bear launched himself, a 75-pound missile of muscle and teeth, and slammed into Henshaw's side. The impact was devastating. Henshaw was torn away from Henry, his life-or-death grip broken. He cried out in pain and shock as Bear's jaws clamped down on his arm. The air rushed back into Henry's lungs in a ragged, desperate gasp. He pushed himself up, his vision clearing. He saw Bear, snarling, shaking his head, refusing to let go of Henshaw's arm. The man was screaming now, trying to beat the dog off with his free hand, but Bear held on with the tenacity of a creature fighting for its entire world. Henry didn't hesitate. He surged forward, grabbing Henshaw from behind and locking his arm around the man's neck in a chokehold. "Let him go, Bear," Henry commanded, his voice raw. "Down!" Instantly, miraculously, Bear released his grip. He backed away, but remained in a low crouch, a deep growl rumbling in his chest, his eyes never leaving the man who had hurt his family. Henshaw struggled for a moment longer in Henry's hold, but it was hopeless. The fight was gone from him, replaced by the agony in his arm and the terrifying reality of his defeat. He went limp, and Henry eased the pressure, not releasing him, but holding him fast. The battle was over. In the smoky, dimly lit cabin, Surrounded by the silence of the mountain, Henry held the defeated man, his loyal partner standing guard, and the life of the woman they had come to save hanging in the balance. The adrenaline that had flooded Henry's system began to recede, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and the sharp, throbbing pain in his head where it had struck the fuselage. The air in the cabin was thick with the smell of smoke, sweat, and fear. Outside, the blizzard continued its relentless assault, a constant mournful howl that seemed to mock the fragile pocket of life within the wreckage. The fight was over, but the battle for survival had just entered a new, critical phase. With Henshaw subdued and limp in his grasp, Henry's training took over, a series of cold, efficient actions that pushed the emotional chaos to the background. He needed to secure the prisoner and call for help. "Hannah," he said, his voice raspy. "In my pack. There's a coil of rope." Hannah, still pale and wide-eyed from the ordeal, nodded and scrambled as best she could with her injured leg towards Henry's discarded backpack. Bear, ever the loyal guardian, moved to her side, nudging her hand with his head as if to offer support. She returned with the rope, her hands trembling. While keeping a firm hold on Henshaw, Henry expertly tied the man's hands and feet, using knots he could have tied in his sleep. He checked them twice, ensuring they were secure enough to hold, but not so tight as to cut off circulation completely. He was a soldier, not a torturer. He rolled the now conscious and groaning Henshaw onto his stomach, far from the briefcase that had cost so much. The man was neutralized. Next, a signal. "Every plane like this has an ELT, an emergency locator transmitter," Henry said, more to himself than to Hannah. "It should have activated on impact, but the crash might have damaged it." He moved into the mangled cockpit, a space of shattered glass, twisted metal, and a chilling silence. He found the ELT panel. A small red light that should have been blinking was dark. Damaged, just as he'd suspected. "Plan B," he muttered. He searched the emergency kits, his hands moving with purpose. He found what he was looking for, a handheld emergency radio, its casing bright orange. He flipped the switch. A reassuring crackle of static filled the cockpit, followed by a faint, steady beep. It had power. He tuned it to the emergency frequency, raised it to his lips, and pressed the transmit button. "Mayday, mayday, mayday," he said, his voice steady and clear, cutting through the static. "This is a civilian survivor at the site of a plane crash, requesting immediate assistance. I am broadcasting from the wreckage. I have 2 survivors, one with a severe leg injury and one hostile in custody. Coordinates are unknown, but we are in the high peaks of the Elk Mountains, south of Aspen. I will broadcast every 15 minutes. Mayday, mayday, mayday." He released the button. The only reply was the hiss of the radio and the howl of the wind. There was no way to know if anyone had heard. All they could do now was wait. He returned to the main cabin. The small embers of the fire had mostly died out, and the cold was beginning to seep in with a vengeance. He found a couple of emergency blankets in a storage compartment and wrapped one around Hannah, who was shivering uncontrollably, her face etched with shock. He gently examined her leg. The splint was functional, but the wound needed to be cleaned and properly dressed. He took out his first aid kit. "This is going to hurt," he said softly. As he worked, cleaning the wound with antiseptic wipes from his kit, a fragile silence settled between them. Bear lay down at Hannah's other side, resting his heavy head on her lap, a warm, solid presence in the terrifying cold. "Thank you," Hannah whispered, her voice barely audible. "He would have... Bear, he saved you." "We saved each other," Henry replied, his focus on wrapping a clean bandage around her leg. "He's a good soldier." He finished his work and sat back on his heels. The waiting was the hardest part. It was in the quiet moments that the ghosts always came. He could feel Owen's memory at the edge of his consciousness, a familiar ache of guilt. He must have unconsciously rubbed his wrist, a nervous habit he'd developed over the years. It was then that Hannah's gaze fell upon it. On his right wrist, he wore a simple, dark brown leather bracelet. It was made of 3 thin strands, expertly braided, worn smooth and soft with age. It was unremarkable to anyone else, but to Hannah it was like a bolt of lightning. Her breath hitched, her eyes, wide with a new kind of shock, were fixed on the small piece of leather. "Where?" she started, her voice a choked whisper. "Where did you get that?" Henry looked down at the bracelet, then back at her, confused by her intense reaction. This? It was a gift? From a friend? "What friend?" she pressed, leaning forward, her injury forgotten. A shadow passed over Henry's face. He rarely spoke of Owen. "His name was Owen Clark. We served together." A single silent tear rolled down Hannah's cheek. The world outside, the storm, the cold, the defeated man lying tied up a few feet away, it all faded away. The cramped space of the fuselage became a sacred, silent place. "Owen Clark," she repeated, the name a prayer on her lips. "He was my brother." The word struck Henry with the force of a physical blow. He stared at her, truly seeing her for the first time. He saw it now in the stubborn set of her jaw, the deep, soulful green of her eyes, the way she held her head with a quiet strength. It was all Owen. The resemblance was so clear, he couldn't believe he had missed it. Stunned silence enveloped them. It was impossible. The odds were astronomical. To have found this plane, in this storm, on this mountain, and for the woman inside to be the sister of the man who haunted his every waking moment. It wasn't chance. It was something else. He slowly reached up and touched the bracelet, the worn leather a direct, tangible link to his past and her present. Owen had made it for him in the long, quiet hours between missions, a symbol of their unbreakable bond. "He told me he made one for his little sister, too," Henry said, his voice thick with emotion. "He said she was the only thing that kept him going over there." Hannah broke down then, the dam of her composure finally shattering. She sobbed, not from fear or pain, but from a complex storm of grief, relief, and a profound, overwhelming sense of wonder. Bear whined softly, licking the tears from her hand. Henry looked at her, at the sister of his fallen friend, and a powerful, gut-wrenching realization washed over him. He hadn't come to these mountains to escape his past. He hadn't been running away from his guilt. All this time, through all his lonely days and haunted nights, he had been running towards this exact moment. He was here to finish one last mission for Owen Clark. He was here to keep a promise he never knew he had to make, to bring his sister home. The wait was a unique form of torture. Trapped in the groaning metal carcass, the world was reduced to the howl of the wind, the hiss of the radio, and the fragile rhythm of their own breathing. Every 15 minutes, Henry would repeat his Mayday call into the void, a ritual of hope against the overwhelming power of the storm. They huddled together for warmth, Henry, Hannah, and Bear, a small, improbable island of life in a sea of frozen desolation. Hannah, exhausted and in pain, drifted in and out of a fitful sleep, her head resting on Bear's warm flank. Hours bled into one another. The darkness outside the cracked windows deepened from the gray of the storm to the absolute black of a mountain night. Doubt, a cold and insidious serpent, began to coil in Henry's gut. Had anyone heard them? Or was his voice just another lost sound swallowed by the blizzard? He looked at Hannah, at her pale, sleeping face, and at the steady presence of the dog beside her. He pushed the doubt away. He had made a promise. He would not break it. It was Bear who heard it first. His head, which had been resting peacefully, snapped up. His ears swiveled, and a low, expectant whine rumbled in his chest. Henry's hand went to the dog's back, a silent question. Bear's tail gave a single, tentative thump against the floor. Then Henry heard it, a sound so faint it was almost part of the wind. A deep, rhythmic thump, thump, thump that was not the storm. It was the sound of machinery, of power, of hope. "A helicopter," Henry breathed, his heart hammering against his ribs. He scrambled to the cockpit and pressed the transmit button on the radio. Rescue aircraft, if you can hear me. This is the survivor of the crash. We hear you. We are in the fuselage of a Beechcraft King Air on a cliff face below the western ridge. A voice, crackling with static but wonderfully, miraculously clear, came back. Survivor, this is Mountain Rescue. We have your signal. We see you. The storm is making a direct winch impossible. We are setting a team down on the ridge above you. Hold tight. Relief, so powerful it was almost painful, washed over Henry. He turned to Hannah, who was now fully awake, her eyes wide and shining with unshed tears. "They're here," he said, his voice thick. "They're coming." It took another hour, an eternity of planning and careful execution by the unseen team above, but finally, figures appeared at the top of the snowy slope. They were professionals, moving with a calm, practiced efficiency that was beautiful to watch. Ropes were secured, and two figures in bright orange search and rescue gear began to rappel down towards the wreckage. The lead rescuer, a man with a calm, weathered face named Miller, was the first one through the opening. His eyes quickly took in the scene. The injured woman, the bound man, the protective dog, and the armed, exhausted civilian who had made it all happen. "Well," Miller said, his voice a beacon of calm in the chaos. "Looks like you've been busy." From there, everything moved with a swift professional blur. Hannah was carefully secured onto a rescue toboggan. Henshaw, silent and defeated, was taken into custody by the second rescuer. The briefcase containing the documents was secured as evidence. When it was Henry's turn, he clipped into the harness. Bear, unwilling to be separated, was fitted into a special harness of his own. As they were winched up into the raging storm, away from the cold metal tomb that had been their prison and their sanctuary, Henry looked down one last time. The wreckage was just a dark shape, already being swallowed again by the snow. The mountain had almost claimed them, but tonight they had won. 3 months later, the snow in the Elk Mountains had given way to the vibrant green of early summer. The cabin that had once been Henry's fortress of solitude was now a home, filled with the sounds of life. The scent of coffee and fresh baking had replaced the stale air of loneliness. Henry sat on the porch steps, watching the sun crest over the distant peaks. The mountains no longer looked like an enemy, but like a silent, powerful witness to his transformation. A heavy head rested on his knee, and he absently stroked the soft fur behind Bear's ears. The dog sighed contentedly, his duty done, his family safe. The screen door creaked open, and Hannah emerged, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. Her leg had healed, leaving behind a scar she now called a reminder. She moved with a grace that belied the ordeal she had survived. She handed a mug to Henry and sat down beside him. "He's dreaming," she said softly, nodding at Bear, whose paws were twitching. "Probably chasing squirrels the size of cars." Henry smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. "He's earned it." The news of what had happened on the mountain had become a local legend. Henshaw and the corporation behind him were facing a mountain of federal charges, thanks to the documents her father had died to protect. But for those on the porch, the headlines were just noise. The reality was here, in the quiet peace of the morning. They had become a family, forged in trauma, and bound by loyalty. In the weeks after the rescue, they had leaned on each other, navigating the labyrinth of hospital visits, police statements, and the overwhelming grief for the father and friend they had both lost. "I was looking through some of Owen's old letters last night," Hannah said, her voice gentle. "He wrote about you a lot. He said you were the calmest man he'd ever met in a storm." Henry took a slow sip of his coffee. The guilt was still there, a faint phantom ache where a gaping wound used to be. But it no longer consumed him. He could remember Owen now not with a flinch of pain, but with a sad, warm fondness. He had kept his promise. He had brought Owen's sister home. "He was the brave one," Henry said. "I just followed his lead." "We have to do something," Hannah said, looking out at the vast wilderness. "For him, for my father, for all the others like them. We can't let their sacrifices be for nothing." And so the idea was born. With the considerable resources from her father's estate, they decided to create something new, something that would turn their pain into purpose. They called it the Owen Clark Foundation. Its mission was simple but profound: to provide support for the families of fallen soldiers and first responders. It would fund scholarships, offer grief counseling, and sponsor outdoor wilderness programs designed to help veterans heal the invisible wounds of war, just as the mountain had, in its own brutal way, healed Henry. A few weeks later, they stood on a plot of land not far from the cabin, looking at the plans for the Foundation's first retreat center. It was a place of hope, a place where peace could begin for others. Bear sat between them, a living, breathing symbol of the loyalty that had started it all. Henry looked at Hannah, her face bright with purpose, and then at the dog who had walked out of a blizzard and led him back to the world. The ghosts of his past were finally quiet, not gone, but at peace. The long war he had been fighting within himself was finally over. He reached down and took Hannah's hand. He was no longer just a survivor. He was a guardian, a partner, a man who had found his way home. The story of Henry, Hannah, and Bear reminds us that true loyalty is a silent promise, a light that can guide us through the most impossible storms. It teaches us that healing doesn't come from running away from the past, but from finding the courage to face it, and that the family we discover in the wreckage is often the one we were always meant to have. If these themes of courage and devotion resonate with you, we hope you will join our community by subscribing. Your support, through likes, shares, and comments, telling us what loyalty means to you, helps us continue to bring these meaningful tales to light. A new journey is just now appearing on your screen, and we invite you to continue sharing these moments with us.